Hi there. Hello, Professor Richard. You're on mute. Can hear you.
Here I am.
Oh, hello. How's it going?
Good.
Hello, Professor Trubeck. Hi,
You're
everyone.
you're muted too, Dave.
Dave is muted.
Dave, you're muted.
Okay. So while we are
Here we go. Okay, I'm unmuted. João Victor, como estás?
Hello. Muito bem. Obrigado, professora. E o senhor?
Tudo bem aqui.
Em minha introdução ao senhor, eu vou falar sobre isso que está acontecendo nesse instante, que é David Trubeck speaking Portuguese.
Exatamente.
Exactly. Yeah. So, well, let's start right on time. Hello, everyone. Just let me see if isn't there anyone waiting in the waiting room. Well, I guess there's some people late. We had about 30 people registered, but we can't wait for all of them to connect. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our first session of the Chilean Law and Society program. My name is João Vitor Cardoso. I'm an associate professor at the University Santo Tomás, and I'm having the honor to moderate this first session of our Chilean Law and Society mentoring program. Before I briefly introduce our speakers, I just want to acknowledge that the Law and Society Association is the sponsor of this project, along with the University of Chile. And we hope this program becomes a room for horizontal networks that go both ways, north and south. As you can see, if you take a look at our audience, we have here people from the US, people from Chile, of course, from Brazil, from China, and from the Waumapu, where I am right now. And there are lots of social legal networks nowadays. The Law and Society Association is the largest of these networks. Today, it encompasses a network of institutions, which the University of Chile is now becoming a member. And this network of institutions through this program is just getting started also. I want to highlight in southern Chile, where with the sponsorship of University Santo Tomás, along with many other universities from Temuco, in an encompassing project, which is like the stepbrother of this one at the University of Chile, which is called Law and Societies from Southern Chile. So now a couple of words on how the workshop will be organized. We're going to start with Professor Trubeck. We're going to take a look at the theoretical framework he's been working on about the emergence of intellectual movements. And then we're going to move to take a look at the emergence of the field of law and society in the US with a presentation by Professor Richard Abel. And once we've done that, we're going to hear David's comment on Ricky's presentation. And finally, we're going to open to Q&A, where one of my main hopes is that it will set the agenda for what is coming forward in our program. Well, now let me give a brief introduction. I mean, you all know them, but I'm gonna give a brief introduction on our speakers. Their careers began together at the Yale Law School in the late 1960s, and they've been close collaborators ever since. In 1969, the Yale Law School received a huge grant from the USAID for a program in law and modernization, which was conceived by David Trubeck, who along with Richard Abel ran it. Now, there has been 50 years since Trubeck and Abel co-launched this program, which was the venue that led to some first efforts to institutionalize law and society movements in Latin America. Professor Richard Abel is the Mitchell J. Connell Distinguished Professor of Law Emeritus at UCLA. He's also a distinguished research professor and has been the faculty coordinator for the Public Interest Law program. I don't know how he does it, but lately he's gone through writing many books. I think there are like 3 volumes on how to stop autocrats. And now he's finishing a last book about efforts to hold Trump accountable since the January 16, 2021's riot. And he's making a little merchandising. He showed up the book right there. So what I also want to say is that for people who are in this field, whatever we call it, a law and society network or movement, his work has been pivotal in many articles and leadership positions. He's laid out how to think about this field. And so I hope we're going to push you today to talk about all of it and how to get started in this art. But also, with us today is Professor Trubeck. And I took the liberty to highlight maybe some feats that are not as frequently highlighted as they should to introduce him. One of his best stories is that Professor Trubeck somehow played a role in the Brazilian democratic transition. Trubeck worked in Brazil in the 80s. He was working with Raimundo Fauro, supporting the Brazilian Bar Association, and at least indirectly, while the bar was fighting to recover Brazilian democracy, Trubeck was working for the Ford Foundation, playing a role behind OAB at the end of the military rule in Brazil. Professor Trubeck's been a participant in critical legal studies. Indeed, he was one of its founders. He's been very active in law and development. Professor Trubeck has a very interesting work on Max Weber and the rise of capitalism, which I read with my undergraduate students just a couple weeks ago. It's very useful. I recommend it. Which was published in 1972. But then he came up with Scholars in Self-Estrangement in 1974, a masterpiece. If you haven't read it, you should do it right now. Get out of this session, this blah, 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 and go read it. But also his studies take different forms that don't always agree with each other. For example, yesterday I found out that there was a lot of fighting between the Law and Society Association people and the critical legal scholars in the US in the 80s. Trubeck wrote a couple of articles trying to make these people get together and work together. So finally, as the organizer, I just would like to say that we're very glad that this group of people is here connected at this network, and just want to thank the Law and Society Association once again for their support. As we shall see, without it, for us in the Global South, it is quite impossible to have this kind of activity going on. And now we're going to listen to these two prominent scholars in law and society world. We're very grateful, Professor Abel and Professor Trubeck, for your help and patience. As you have seen, this project is permanently under construction. In the long run, we're committed to trying to create an audience that deserves your attention. And this is our main challenge. So I'm going to pass now the word to Dan. Passing the word now to them. Thank you so much.
Okay, now, are you going to keep it with these small pictures, or do I get a full screen? Only because I want to show something, but it's not.
Yeah, I think now we can close our cameras and leave just Professor Trubeck while he's presenting. Afterward, we open our cameras again, okay?
I think what Professor Trubeck is asking, Joao, is for him to be host so he can share his screen.
No, I'm not going to share the screen.
All right.
I'm just going to hold something up. I wish I had thought to do that, to get ready for it, but I didn't. So, okay, so this isn't going to get any bigger, huh? Well, okay.
Now we're bigger, Professor. We're all seeing you.
I'm bigger, but I'm not
screen.
bigger on my screen.
No, but for us, you are.
Oh, well, okay, whatever.
I put you the pin, so now we are just seeing your camera.
Can you see this? Now, this is a handout. Does everybody have this? Can you see what I'm holding up? I sent this out and asked that everyone be given a copy of this one-page document.
Yeah,
Salvador, sounds like you have.
Everyone's got a copy.
Okay, all right, good. That's fine. So we're not going to take a lot of time on this. This is the scientific intellectual movements and new knowledge movements. This is a general framework for studying all sorts of academic scientific movements. And since you are interested in not just the United States, but also Brazil and possibly other countries, and how they formed law and society type associations, we thought this might be useful. It's not necessarily a guide, and it's not necessarily a dynamic model, but it's a useful checklist of issues that anyone trying to understand the history of a new scientific movement like the creation of the Law and Society Association might take account of. And I'm going to go very quickly through what's on the on this framework. So this is organized chronologically and suggests a kind of dynamics that you may or may not find exactly this way in other in various countries. High status individuals critique the central tendencies. There's something wrong here. We're not dealing with the real issues. We're not understanding what's really happening, let's say, in law. The idea of high status is that elite actors can take risks. I will say, I won't go into detail, but as you listen to Rick, you're going to hear a number of these, because we did not use this as a guide, but it was a useful checklist when we were done, and we pretty much found something on all of these factors. The second is that there's structural conditions that give these leading actors resources they need: money, jobs, publications, methods of coordination. As you will see, all of this is relevant to the American story. Then they talk about micro-mobilization context. That's a very fancy term, but they're talking about conferences, departments, retreats, places where people get together and say, look, we've got this new idea, why don't you come and join us? And then the last item, ideas resonate with participants in the field. That's sort of, going back and saying, you see, we've been doing this all along, this is really what we do. Placing it, trying to sort of make it seem like it's not a disruption of the old ideas, or at least not a bad one. So that's what affect the likelihood of emergence. And then the rest of it deals with the possibility of linking a new intellectual movement to what they call a new knowledge movement. New knowledge movements are movements that are consciously creating knowledge to drive social and legal change. It's interdisciplinary, it's multi-actor, and it provides information for action. It sees law, both as in the case of law, it sees law as a barrier to change and a resource for activism. Integrates empirical research and what participants say is going on, and evaluates effects of strategies, outlines promising directions. These are the things you should look for in a movement, a new knowledge movement connected to the evolution of law and society. There's a more detailed version of this for anyone who wants to get involved in it, and you can access that from João Victor. So, as I say, we didn't use this as a guideline exactly, but as you listen to Rick's presentation, you will hear many of these factors played a role in law and society evolution in the US. And so, once more, for the 483rd time, over to you, Rick.
Okay, well, thank you, Dave. Dave and I, as Joan mentioned, have been collaborating now for almost 60 years, and I think we work very well together. We actually launched a new course at Yale in the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s called Comparative Legal Sociology, in which we did, or are trying to do, precisely what Dave has just described. So Dave has given you a theoretical framework. That's his forte, as his work on Weber demonstrates. I'm going to give you lots of facts and see if you can fit them into the framework, and also contrast them with Chile. I'm going to be very US-centered because I'm going to describe our own experience, and I'm going to be fairly elliptical in talking about each of these topics because I'm covering a very wide swath of territory over 125 years, as you'll see in a second, and a large number of disciplines and the ways in which they interacted. Some of this, many of you will know, but I think it's at least worth mentioning, and some of it is quite specific and will probably be new to almost all of you. Let me start with the legal environment, and this I think is what all of you will know about, but I want to stress it. Law and society emerged in the United States And the United States legal environment is, I think, unique. It is part of the common law world, but it's different from many of the other common law countries. So the fact that it's a common law country means that judicial decisions, not codes, are the basic source of the law. And those decisions are rendered by judges, making judges, not legislators or academics, the principal actors in the legal system, the people with the greatest influence and power. Those judges are chosen by a political process, either appointment or election. They are not civil service jobs in the sense that they are in Western Europe and many other countries. Judges are known for innovating. In fact, they are very proud to innovate, and that is one way in which they gain status and authority. And then finally, the legal academy in the US differs from that in most of Latin America, at least until recently. Legal academy is a career position. It is a full-time position. It is actually very well paid. It is moderately well respected. But it gives American legal academics a great deal of time to spend on research, theory, and writing. We typically teach 5 hours a week. That is all, and we have sabbaticals. So the fact that legal academics have played a central role in developing law and society is partly a function of the privileged positions in which they operate. Okay. There's an important sense in which law and society derives from a tradition that's more than 100 years old, i.e. legal realism. Legal realism is not uniquely American. There was Scandinavian legal realism before there was American, but it was not well known in the US. But American legal realism has a long and illustrious pedigree. The first thing I would point to is an article by Oliver Wendell Holmes, a justice on the Supreme Court, the most respected of the justices during his time. And he said in an article called The Path of the Law in 1897, "The prophecies of what courts will do in fact, and nothing more pretentious, are what I mean by the law." So that was a foundation for legal realism more than 125 years ago. The second part of the institutional picture is that that statement by Holmes was roughly contemporaneous with the emergence of the case and Socratic method as a method of legal instruction in the US. It began at Harvard in the late 19th century and largely took the rest of the legal academic world by storm. So all students for the last 100 years have been taught by criticizing cases and highlighting the work of creative judges. I'll give you just two names, which I think will be familiar to many of you, even outside the United States: Benjamin Cardozo and Richard Posner. Cardozo on the Second Circuit and Posner on the Seventh. They both wrote very influential books, An Economic Approach to Law from Posner and The Nature of the Judicial Process from Cardozo. So I want to emphasize the role of judges, and I think that is central to the emergence of law and society in the US. Legal realism really began formally in the 1930s. Carl Llewellyn was perhaps its greatest and most colorful exponent. He wrote a book with an anthropologist, Adamson Hobel, called The Cheyenne Way, published in 1941. It's interesting just to dwell on that for a moment because it, I think, says something about a peculiarity of law and society in the United States, which is that many of its earliest practitioners, Dave and myself included, but many others you'll see with the names, had experience abroad. And it was the experience of a legal system different from their own that made them raise questions about their own legal system. So although comparison often is not explicitly engaged in, I think the comparison that was inherent in being exposed to a different legal system is part of the emergence. So legal realism emerged and expanded. Llewellyn applied what he called Holmes's cynical acid to rules. Jerome Frank, another legal realist, a fact skeptic, said the same about the ways in which facts are found. And I should just add, again, which I think all of you know, but which is very important, fact-finding pretty much universally in the criminal process and voluntarily in the civil process is done by juries, i.e. by lay people, and that obviously shapes both the law and law and society. So there were early studies. Thurman Arnold wrote at Yale. William Douglas, the later justice on the Supreme Court, wrote about the causes of bankruptcy in 1932. Johns Hopkins University, even though it had no law faculty, began to engage in empirical studies about law. Llewellyn was, at least for a period of time, at Columbia. There was the beginning of empirical research at Yale. There's a famous New Haven parking study in which Underhill Moore apparently set up a chair on the sidewalk in New Haven and watched whether people obeyed or did not obey parking laws. And that led to a book called Law and Learning Theory, A Study of Legal Control in 1943. And I discovered another book, which is of interest both to me and especially to Dave, by Charles Clark and Harry Shulman, A Study of Law Administration in Connecticut, 1937. Dave clerked for Clark after he graduated from law school, and may want to say something about that. Okay, I'm going to come back to the funding in a minute, but starting in the 1950s, before Dave and I became faculty members, there was money to fund collaborative work between law professors and social scientists. So Joe Goldstein, who was a law professor, but who had a degree from LSE as well, and had been analyzed as a future lay analyst himself by Anna Freud, collaborated with Jerome Skolnick and Richard Schwartz on books about the criminal law, and with Jay Katz on books about family law. What I want to stress about this, and I know this from the perspective at least of Skolnick and Schwartz, they felt that they were in subordinate positions. They were not being considered for tenured positions on the faculty. There's a phrase, I don't know where its origin, that social scientists were on tap, not on top. So the lawyers defined the questions, and they looked to the social scientists to do the grubby, time-consuming, and insufficiently dignified empirical work to demonstrate the answers to the questions that they posed. I'm going to bring in a personal anecdote, which I think will help to illuminate the larger question. I studied law at Columbia in 1962 to 65. I had chosen law over sociology because I wanted to be engaged in activism, not just in research, but I came with a sociological perspective, which had been formed by David Reisman and Talcott Parsons, with whom I had studied. I found studying law at Columbia in the early 60s profoundly frustrating. In the criminal law, we spent almost the entire year on the general part. Could you commit an impossible crime? I wanted to know who was being prosecuted, who they were, what the alleged offenses were, what happened to them, and what prison was like. None of that was even mentioned, because that was criminology, not criminal law. In contracts, we studied the formation of contracts, but not whether anybody actually used contracts. It was at that same time that Stuart Macaulay at Wisconsin was studying the actual contractual behavior of business people, especially between car manufacturers and automobile dealers. I felt the same thing about property, about corporations, labor law, comparative law. And the only place I really found a locus where law was being looked at from a social scientific perspective was a course I took on African law, which was why I then went to Kenya several years later to study the actual operations of law. I had the same kinds of frustrations when I began to teach law, first at Yale for 5 years, and then at UCLA for the rest of my career. I tried to bring in sociology in various ways. So, for instance, I taught intentional torts, and I brought in anthropological studies of defamation. Who actually defames people, and what are the consequences? Why do people engage in battles through words? I taught family law. And I actually took a year off to practice law in New Haven Legal Assistance so that I get experience in the practice of family law. And then when I taught it, I brought practitioners, social workers, judges, lawyers, etc., into the classroom. When I taught torts, finally, first at Yale and then at UCLA, I brought in the first really excellent empirical study of what people actually do when they're injured. It was a study done at Oxford, the Socio-Legal Center, the so-called misfortune study, and it looked at the actual behavior, and it was replicated by the Rand Corporation in the United States. And especially I did that when I began teaching legal profession, which I taught as a sociology of the professions course, not as a legal ethics course. And later, at the end of my career teaching that, I turned it into a course about the careers of lawyers, which my students, of course, were very interested in because they could use it as a way of trying to plot their own careers. Okay, I can come back to that, but I want to move on to, because I have a lot of ground to cover. I want to talk something about the history of the United States from the early 20th century to the post-war period. And I want to flag some of the major moments in that because I think they affected the why people changed the ways they were looking at law. First, there was the Great Depression in 1929, which lasted really until World War I, so for over 12 years in the United States, and which spawned, as you know, in the New Deal, government intervention in the economy, the end of the night watchman state, and the creation of the regulatory state and large numbers of regulatory agencies. It exposed the political ideology of Supreme Court justices who initially were free marketeers, striking down almost all of FDR's legislative program. They were also anti-union. FDR proposed to pack the courts, and the courts miraculously changed their line. That gave a great deal of insight into the politicization of decision-making, at least in the Supreme Court, which became a focus of study in the years thereafter. After World War II, during World War II and the immediate aftermath, there was a very high level of inflation. The government created something called the Office of Price Administration. So that was a direct regulation of the economy, something that was actually being considered by the Biden administration during the recent rise in inflation, which was not used again, although it was used earlier. I have, again, a personal experience, mainly from hearing it as a child. Both my father and my father-in-law worked at the OPA, so I was aware of what it was actually doing. Okay, then there were civil liberties fights. In World War I, there were anti-war and conscientious objection movements. They were treated very harshly. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there was the rise of anti-communism, the Palmer raids, and then later the McCarthy era. And that gave rise to and gave a major role to the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Lawyers Guild, again showing the political nature of law and the way in which law could be used to protect civil liberties. Again, during the New Deal, FDR and Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act in 1935, and the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. That put labor activism front and center. Unions expanded very rapidly. They never became quite as powerful as they are in many other countries, but they had a union density of over 35% at their height, and union activity was, again, a center point. That brings us to the post-war era of prosperity and the beginning of an American century and the rise of social movements. And those profoundly affected the emergence of law in society. So there was the civil rights movement, the NAACP's battle against segregation in all areas, but especially in education, the Brown decision in 1954. All of that, by the way, inspired me. I was on the March on Washington in the summer of 1963. I worked in Washington in 1964. I went to Mississippi in 1965. There was the anti-war movement because people were drafted. There was a great deal of campus activism. Dave and I were both there when the campus was suffused with tear gas and there were shutdowns. There was the rise of feminism. When we began as law students, Dave's wife, Louise, was one of a tiny handful of law students at Yale. When I went to law school in 1962, there were only 5 women in my class of 300. Women are now a majority in almost every law school in the United States and increasingly a majority of law teachers. There was criminal justice reform under the Warren Court. There was environmentalism and the Environmental Protection Act. There was Ralph Nader's activism around consumer protection. There was LGBTQ activism and anti-poverty. On the anti-poverty front, LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, created the Great Society and the War on Poverty. The Office of Economic Opportunity created legal services, i.e. nationalizing legal aid in 1964. That was what I worked for in 1971-72 in New Haven. Poverty was discovered. Michael Harrington wrote a book called The Other America. And the reform of legal services gave rise to legal needs studies and law reform activity. The fact that the United States became the dominant world power after World War II meant that the United States turned outwards. So Dave may well talk about this when he comments on what I'm saying. The emergence of the Alliance for Progress, the role of USAID abroad, the Ford Foundation's interest in foreign countries. The government created something called the Foreign Area Fellowship Program, which sent me to Kenya in 1967-68. When my daughter Laura, who's watching anonymously on this, spent her first year. Dave and Bill were both in Dave and Bill Felston were both in USAID. The Ford Foundation created a spin-off for the International Legal Center, which created the Sailor Program, staffing of African institutions of legal education and research. And the last thing I want to say about the general environment was the counterculture. The hog farm, which was a commune, set itself up in the Yale Law School courtyard. Duncan Kennedy and Peter Gable wrote Move Over Beethoven. Charlie Reich wrote The Greening of America. The counterculture played a significant role. Okay, now I'm coming to the institutional bases of law and society. The American Bar Foundation, which was a spinoff of the ABA, the American Bar Association, was founded in 1952. It's been quite well funded. Its focus for many years was mostly on the legal profession. In 1961, the UC Berkeley created the Center for the Study of Law and Society. It may be of interest to you to know that that was done explicitly in order to neuter the criminology department, which was seen as too Marxist, and the criminologists who did not have tenure were fired, and those who did have tenure were brought under the aegis of the law school in the hopes that that would make them more conservative. Buffalo had the Baldy Center from 1978 and the first non-lawyer dean in the United States when Richard Schwartz became the dean. Mark Galanter later joined them. And Wisconsin had Willard Hurst, a legal historian, who got Stuart Macaulay and Lawrence Friedman to develop the first course book, Law and the Behavioral Sciences. Dave joined the faculty later. Tom Heller, Bob Gordon, Mark Tushnet, Joel Grossman, Dirk Hartog. That brings us to the Yale Law and Modernization Program, which Dave founded and which I joined when I joined the faculty in '69. That was a grant of $1 million from USAID. That is now, the equivalent now would be $13 million. It included Dave and myself, Bill Felston, who had experience in both Turkey and India. It had fellows like Mark Galanter, who had experience in India, Tom Heller in Colombia, Boaventura dos Santos, whose work I know all of you know, Helene Itzfart, who was Dutch, who went to Chile under Allende and was going to study the popular courts until the Pinochet coup.
Rick?
Yeah.
We're running too long,
Okay.
and I'm gonna be out of time. So could you finish up quickly?
I can finish up. And thank you for stopping me. Okay, so we have law and society as an emerging field. It was thriving. It began in meetings in 1975. It initially with 300 members. The meetings now have over 2,000 members. It has the Journal of the Law and Society Review. I'm not going to say more about that. I can say it in response to Dave's interventions. It has become extremely subspecialized. It has 57 collaborative research networks and 56 international research collaboratives. And I just want to end by mentioning two competitive approaches to law, which emerged roughly contemporaneously with law and society. One is critical legal studies, and I'll leave it to Dave if he wants to say something about that, because he, again, really founded that with the first meeting in Wisconsin. And the other is law and economics, about which people in Chile will know all too much, because the same Chile boys who went down to Chile under Pinochet to create a free market economy also transformed law with their free market approaches. Okay, sorry to go on so long, Dave. Go back to you, and I'll only come back when you ask me to.
Okay, well, I don't want to.
Dave, just one word. People are saying it's very interesting. They're very entertained. So I think you guys could go ahead and end up by like 2:30. This first half of the presentation by both of you. So then we will open to the interaction with the audience. Okay.
So wait, but you're saying we could go till 2:30?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we could, so we can enjoy more.
You know, we have. I did want to say I should have said this in the very beginning. This has been a wonderful experience, and I know Rick did also got very intrigued by this history. I got fascinated. Some of the things I knew, some of the things I forgot, and some of the things I didn't know at all. And so we've put in quite a bit of time. So we have a lot to report. Okay, so I think that what I wanted to emphasize in the history, and it comes through in Rick's presentation, I just want to underscore, are the importance of two things: money and politics in the formation of law and society. Money was extremely important from the beginning. The first funds came from several foundations, which were either general foundations like Ford or focus foundations like the Walter Meyer Foundation and Russell Sage. One of the things that happened, don't forget, Law and Society is formed officially in '64. That is also the year in which the Great Society was announced as a political program for the US government. So you see that there's a coincidence of a major left liberal political movement pushing vast amounts of money into reform of welfare, health, legal services, and many other things, and the formation of the Law and Society. It all happened in the same year. But before that, for 4 or 5 years, these specialist foundations were providing funds to a variety of universities for the purpose, there not being any Law and Society Association yet, to create law and society movements. And of course, the two most important were Berkeley, at that time, with Berkeley and Wisconsin. So this was, for me, a very important part of my experience was the Wisconsin Center. So these foundations provided funds to set up and develop the original Law and Society programs at 4 universities. I stress Berkeley and Wisconsin. They became the most important over time. It was the people in those associations, and in those departments or universities that got together in '64 to create the association. And they were aided because a specific grant was given just for the purpose of creating an association. So you see, we have money to create the network of scholars and money to actually formalize an association. And I think that's important because if you're looking to do something in Chile, you probably should be looking for money. Let me just check the time. So that's money number one. Also, there's a sort of vaguely left liberal quality to the grants and the foundations that are doing this. And they are also supporting all sorts of other types of work. Some of them, some are law specialized, but there are many foundations, of course, that are doing a lot of other things. But a lot of this work is creating the groundwork and developing the ideas that led to the Great Society programs announced in '64. And these Great Society programs were very, very well funded. I mean, in today's dollars, many, many billions of dollars were available. And that's the second source of money, because by the time that the programs were underway and beginning to operate, that's, let's say, 65, 6, 7, the Law and Society Association was organized, and the big centers were beginning to develop serious cadres of people, and they were able to keep that going by getting grants to do research on the issues raised by the Great Society. So studies were done of the effect of welfare programs, studies were done of the role of judges and access to lawyers, all sorts of things that were, and some of them were funded directly from one or more of these government agencies that had been created in '64 with the rise of the Great Society. So there's money number two. Money number one, to get the thing started, and money number two, to keep it going, but also, I think, to allow it to grow and become embedded in the universities in ways that might not have been possible if it hadn't had access to this burgeoning government programs in the social and economic justice areas. Over to you, Rick.
Well, there's a lot I could say, but I want to say one thing, which is that social science is really the core of law and society. The law part is really on the periphery. Dave mentioned the center at Berkeley, which is actually physically located outside the law school and is independent from the law school. There were programs, quite ambitious programs, at both New York University and Arizona State University. They had significant funding. They produced graduate students over a period of time, and both of them have been abolished. So universities are reluctant to put a lot of money into law and society. And I think it's fair to say that, certainly it's my experience and Dave's experience, in the law school world itself, we are always marginal on the periphery. If you look at the people who write for the Law and Society Review or who attend meetings of the Law and Society Association, the vast majority of them are social scientists. So lawyers, again, tend to be consumers rather than producers of law and society. Not 100% by any means, but it is much more central to social science than it is to law.
Okay. I'm just looking at. So Rick said that the social scientists were on tap, but not on top, suggesting that in the early years, the hierarchy was lawyers above social scientists. I think in looking at the history of the creation of the Law and Society Association, you can see that there was a desire to create an autonomous field so that the social scientists would have, as we could say, a field of one's own. And I believe that that was a direct result of their chafing at the hierarchy in the previous period when things were just getting started. The feeling that if we had our own field, then they can't just treat us as handmaidens, as they were. And I said we could call on society the handmaiden's revenge, referring to a rather famous book of that title.
Okay, let me jump in there. This is a very crude periodization, but nevertheless, it may be somewhat helpful, which is that the first generation of law in society, let's say from the early 60s to the late 70s, was focused on trying to understand how government programs for social improvement could be made more effective. Because it was the Great Society, it was a war on poverty, and government was seen as the engine of progress. Hard to believe now. And then, of course, everything changed with Nixon, and then especially with Reagan, and government was seen as the enemy. And that, of course, is the position of the Republican Party today, and therefore of probably a majority of Americans themselves. And that coincided with, and I think caused to some extent, a retreat from a focus on government to a focus on other things, micro studies, legal consciousness, social movements, on civil society and individuals, rather than on the government, because the government was not going to do anything good and might only do bad things. And that was a major shift in both theorization and in subject matter, choice of subject matters from the 80s onward. And I think it still shapes the field today. And then, of course, the other major influence, I think, was the emergence of identity politics broadly construed. Initially civil rights, then feminism, then LGBTQ, and now more generally a host of things. For instance, what Kimberly Crenshaw, who's been a colleague of both Dave and myself, calls intersectionality, the multiple identities of people. And that is clearly very much a preoccupation of scholarship today. I'd be happy to turn it over to Q&A, since I think we've talked long enough.
Agree.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Abel, Professor Trubeck. I think this is great. Now I think we can open up the word to the floor and start like elaborating some questions to the. You guys had some questions to the audience. I don't know if you want to bring it up right now or leave it for afterward.
No. Let's get questions about our talk. The questions for the audience.
Yeah, it's for the end. Yeah, it's for us.
We want to get questions about what we talked about.
There is already a lot to chew on. So, guys, the floor is open to your questions. I have many, but I leave it to you. We have Alvaro from Florida State University. And then we have Diego Rocho, who is actually in California, neighboring Professor Abel, and then Professor Agustin Barroalet. So Alvaro.
I believe that Agustin raised his hand first, so if he wants to go first, I'll be happy to give the word to him.
Yeah, actually, I didn't see.
I'm part of the team of organizers, so you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Agustin. So first, I just wanted to correct you, wrong, not Florida State, University of Florida. It's an important distinction there, but just because there's a little bit of a rivalry between schools, so I know that people who see this are going to get mad at me if I don't correct. I was very interested in everything that you were saying about the challenges that law and society as a field of study has faced from its beginnings. And reading a lot of your papers that were sent, I actually came up with a few questionings of my own, because like currently we have maybe I wouldn't say a bigger challenge, but definitely different challenges, especially from the academic point of view, and especially speaking about American public schools, in which many of these perspectives that were put forth by law and society, especially the ones that talk about feminist theory and critical theory, have been under attack. A lot of professors have been persecuted for their ideas, and mostly just for trying to ask certain questions. And you did mention there's mentioned in the papers that some policies often ignore certain things and go too quantitative and are sometimes acritical. So my question is basically, what kind of challenges do you think currently we face when trying to study law and society, when we are being most of the time censored for asking questions such as if there's a difference in treatment in the law regarding race and gender, or these questions sometimes can't even be asked from a perspective of public funding. So what do you say? What would you say would be a way to mitigate these challenges for people, especially those who are trying to get public funding for that kind of research?
Thank you.
Well,
So,
I'm so far from this current scene, particularly the financial end, since I've stopped getting grants. I can't really be too helpful. I mean, I think the important thing to understand is that the dependence, the availability of money is connected to the politics of the moment, and the period that we focused on, which was the period in which law and society was formed and really got started. That's, was what we thought you especially wanted to learn about, was a period in which the politics and thus the money was in the right way. So the questions you're asking, really, I wish I could tell you, just change the title or something. I really don't know. I guess talk to somebody who's been successful. That's my advice. Rick?
Well, like Dave, I've been retired for a long time, and I'm mercifully not having to deal with these, but they're very serious. So again, our colleague Kimberly Crenshaw has been in the forefront in defending critical race theory, and it is clearly under attack. And the Republicans have made it clear that they believe the culture wars are an effective mechanism to seek and wield political power. It's going to be very much part of the current election campaign, has been part of the current election campaign. As far as I know, it has not affected the university yet, but I'm not sure that if the worst comes to the worst and we have the second Trump administration, whether that will be true in the future. One of the 3 books that I wrote about the first Trump administration was called How Autocrats Attack Expertise. And it's about the pandemic primarily, but not exclusively. Respect for science, for expertise more generally in the American public has declined dramatically. And it's declined because people like Trump say, I don't believe in science, I believe in my gut, and my gut knows more than anybody else. He believes that about medicine. Unfortunately, he believes that about the economy. He would like to control the Federal Reserve. He believes that about law. He would like to control the Justice Department. So if we have a second Trump administration, I think the defense of expertise is going to have to be a central part of both academic work and political work, and it's not going to be easy. I must say, as an expert, I don't really understand the detestation of experts. I am an expert in some things, and I am a complete novice about my computer or my cell phone. And when I have a problem, I look to experts, and I would be lost without them. I don't understand how people can feel this sort of generalized hostility towards expertise in a society and a technology where we are increasingly dependent on them. It's not an answer to your question. It's a restatement of the problem.
Well, I think that you have to be careful in defining research that may, you may have to be looking for non-obtrusive measures that would allow you to do the research without a big expenditure, because certainly, there's a significant chance that funding in this area, already tight, will get tighter. And so we want the field to continue. We're going to have to figure out ways to proceed without massively expensive surveys and things like that. Okay.
Yeah.
Other question?
Next question, Diego.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for David and Rick, and these are really not.
Something wrong.
I'm hearing you like a robot. Sorry.
Let me see this.
Much better.
That's better.
Right now?
better.
Yeah, okay. It's clear now. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for your talk, David and Rick. And my question, it's to some extent similar to the prior one, but I was wondering, in your view, what are nowadays, and in terms of research, the main challenge of the law and society movement at a global scale? What for you are the most relevant topics that people should be addressing right now within the law and society field?
Well, one topic, the topic that I have been personally trying to develop is resistance, the role of lawyers in authoritarianism, particularly the role of lawyers in resisting authoritarian movements. I think that I'm told that there are quite a few papers on this topic at the Law and Society meeting. Now, how many people here are planning to attend the Law and Society meeting? Wow. Anybody else? Diogo, aren't you going to be there for the meeting?
I wanted to, but I had some problems with my current research. So for 2026, I'm going to be there, but not this time.
Well, one of the things that I was very surprised by, and it shows how far out of touch I am with Law and Society, was their decision to be 100% in person, no Zoom, which I think is a terrible thing for an organization that wants to be international in this day and age. My modest contribution to that is I'm going to try to develop at Wisconsin a new project on lawyers and authoritarianism, and we will try to get all the papers that are being given on lawyers and authoritarianism at the Law and Society meeting and have them on a Zoom call around sometime before or after Law and Society. I think that is a growing area of concern, and I know that Fabio de Sai Silva, who's going to give the next talk on the Brazil event, has organized at least one and possibly 2 or 3 panels on lawyers and authoritarianism for the meeting. But if you're not going to be there, the only possibility is that the Wisconsin Center might try to have a Zoom event with those same people. That's just a little advertisement for my project.
I would just add about that. I mean, I think, Diego, it is one of the questions I wanted this group to address in any case, and I offered my own answer, which is like Dave's. But I was able to focus on law and autocracy, lawyers and autocracy in the U.S. over the last 8 years, because I have the privilege of being retired. I can do anything I want. I have no incentives that are determining me, and I'm self-funding because I can do this without anything else. And I can work on a project that will take 8 years to bear fruit. And those of you in academia, especially without tenure, are not in that kind of situation. So I'm very much aware of the constraints. You will have to find ways of connecting the big questions that take a long time to answer and that can't typically be answered quantitatively with the smaller questions that where a quantitative approach and where you can produce publishable papers in the short term is also possible. If people are interested, I could talk to you individually about that within my own domain. But you know, I've been retired for 16 years, and for all that time, I've been working on these projects on the defense of the rule of law during the war on terror, and then the defense of liberal democracy under Trump. But that's the privilege of retirement, that all of you have something to look forward to.
Agustin?
My turn. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, David, for the wonderful talk. So I have two questions. One is more practical, the other one is more personal. So let's go with the first one, which will be the second one, which will be easier. So it seems obvious to me that it's really easy to bring forth ideas of law and society for postgraduate research and doctorate programs in Latin America, which is, it's clear to many of us that we don't have the method, and that basically the most interesting projects you can do at a PhD at law or an equivalent of an SJD here would be ones that take a view about the law, or teach you something. It's not only your opinion about what the law is, but rather this socio-legal view. But the legal education in Chile is an undergraduate education, right? It's the kind of French degree, LLB, 5 years. And it's really hard to get 18, 21-year-olds to basically grasp many of the things we teach in law and society. So my first question is, how do we go about it to connect what we do at research with undergraduate teaching in these Napoleonic law schools? And my second question, which is more personal, and I wish Deborah Hensler or Lawrence Friedman would be here hearing me. I was trained at Stanford in the Spiels program that Lawrence and Deborah run there. So it always struck to me that many people here in Chile take for granted that if you're going to be in law and society, you have to be on the left, but really compromised on the left. And I found myself not to be there in my political positions. And I used a lot of socio-legal, basically teachings in law and closed communities and the kind of the research that you were talking about, Richard, not long ago, the one that basically doesn't take into account the government that much. And I don't mind identity politics. It's just, I'm not concerned that much about that. But I think in many places in Latin America and here in Chile, people have kind of taken for granted that you have to be on the left to basically belong to one society group or community. And it kind of leaves me in a weird position, because I just many of those things I don't follow really, and so those are my two questions. Well, can I belong, and how do we do about teaching in undergraduate?
I want to respond to the first one. It seems to me of all the people that you might want to ask that question to, we're maybe the least useful. Because of the total difference of the way the American universities work. And my advice would be, talk to people that do law and society in countries, France, for example, and figure out how they make it work. Because we know that there are civil law countries where there's law and society programs and a lot of people teaching in law schools, and they must have figured it out. But we had trouble dealing with much older and more experienced people. So I don't think our advice is like
I
to be
I
helpful
think
on that.
the French are holding up because of the funding, but they don't go deep into how law is taught in France.
But I would second what Dave said. So there are other countries you could look to as well. I would think the Netherlands would be a good example because there was a period of time in which every Dutch university law faculty had a mandatory course in sociology of law, and they had a sociologist of law on the faculty. And that was it was a big lecture class, so everybody took it. I had friends who taught it, but they're no longer teaching it. So I can't give you names, but I would think the Netherlands would be one place. And of course, England would be another, because law is a first degree in England as well. And there are thriving law and society programs at several of the English universities. But let me go to your second question, which is in many ways the more pointed and one which I share. I don't do a dandy politics either. I'll give an anecdote about that. So critical legal studies began as a mostly white men, although there were white women involved as well. And then there was a feminist femcrit group that came out of it, and that was thrived for a long period of time. And then we actually helped to create critical race theory at UCLA in the first critical race theory conference. And then gay, lesbian, etc. rights became an issue. And there was a last meeting of critical legal studies that I attended, and I was told I should go to my identity group. And I said, well, I don't have an identity group. And I said, well, of course you do. You can find one. You could go to the Jewish identity group. Well, I don't disavow my identity as a Jew, but it's not where I would go. It's not where the issues are. So I share your frustration about the centrality of identity politics, but it's not the totality by any means. There are plenty of other issues. So for instance, here is an issue, and I don't know you, Augustine, but I think we probably could agree about the basic ingredients of the rule of law as the bedrock of any liberal democracy, and the need to understand the threats that they are experiencing and how they can be defended. That is really why I've spent the last 20 years on those topics that I think don't track party lines, although now, of course, they do, but until recently did not track party lines. And the other thing I would say, and this goes back to my response to perhaps to Alvaro and to Diego as well, it was a second set of questions one of the sets of questions that I posed for us to think about, which is encounters with law in your daily life and the kinds of questions, socio-legal questions, that those generate. They can be very useful in the classroom. They can be very useful to have students go out and do their own research. I offered one just because it's what drives me crazy in my hometown, which is ambient noise from leaf blowers and lawn mowers and barking dogs and loud cars and radios, etc. And there are all sorts of laws that apply to it, none of which are enforced. So it is a very fertile field, and there are plenty of other examples one could give, of law in action and its failure to do the things that it's supposed to do, to try to understand, well, what is it doing? Why isn't it doing what you want it to do? And could it be made to do those things?
There's a story in the New York Times today that suggests a project of very much this nature. So New York has laws against jaywalking. Jaywalking means crossing a street when the light is red and you're not supposed to cross. In New York, where I live, jaywalking is extremely popular, and so the mayor just announced a new law has been passed making jaywalkers legal. It is now legal to jaywalk in New York. Now, there's a great paper, and it wouldn't cost a lot of money, and you could just talk to people, and there's a kind of study that everyday life. I might, if any of you are in New York, I would jump at it, and I'll be glad to help you.
It's like the parking study in New Haven in 1937.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. I mean, similar, yes. Anyway, and I've been watching this myself because, of course, I don't jaywalk. I want to make this very clear. I don't jaywalk. I'm tempted to, but my wife won't let me. But don't tell anybody. And so I sit there and I watch this, like I walk, for an hour here in Brooklyn. And so there it is. You see, everyday life offers stuff that you could do, and it doesn't require grants from the Ford Foundation. Not that I would turn down a grant from the Ford Foundation if there were one available. Okay, so it's almost 2:45. Are you going to?
We still have a lot of time, Professor. I just want to add something about what Professor Agustin just said. We've had a Law and Society meeting in Chilean Law and Society Association foundation meeting in Santiago like a couple of weeks ago. And I remembered now that a colleague made a joke about this student of him who is being caught up in this social legal discourse. And we threatened the career of that boy because, of course, he could have been a very successful tax lawyer, but we were coming up with this blah, blah, blah social legal studies. And then actually this provoked me an insight when I was reading the paper you sent us, because actually, I don't know, I'm not sure. I don't actually believe that many people who are trying to engage in social legal studies in Chile and elsewhere are genuinely committed, or they genuinely feel like there is something wrong in society, and that law plays a role in this, like a, maybe some people just want to be the cool kids in the block. We want to look like some postmodern, alternative, hippie style scholars. So then I would like to ask Dave, why not did you mention the FGV experiment when to answer Professor Augustin's question, because you've been very close related, as far as I know, to the creation of the law, FGV law, weren't you?
Well, close is not, I was helpful, but it's been a while ago. And I haven't followed it. I am actually going to look back into it because I will be sitting in on the Brazil event, and so I can't speak specifically to how how FGV professors, whether I'm pretty sure that they do successfully get some socio-legal studies into the undergraduate law curriculum. I'm pretty sure they do. It's been too long since I checked on all that. Ask Fabio. I mean, you're going to talk to him in a couple of weeks. In fact, can I give you some advice about the Brazil session? It's a little off the subject, but since I've got you, if you have specific questions about Brazil, I strongly suggest that you write to Fabio copying me. He's extremely busy, and it comes at a rather bad time for him because he'd already made all sorts of arrangements for that period of time. So the more specific the questions that you could ask him to address, the more likely it'll be a successful event. And if you send a copy to me, I can look into those things that I can study from a distance. So that's my advice about the November 15th event. I would do that. Don't tell Fabio that I said he wasn't going to have enough time to prepare, because
well, we're being recorded, Professor Trubeck, so we'll be online in a couple of weeks. So maybe he's going to know that anyway. But yeah, but I just about bringing it a little bit to Chilean ground here to bring in the discussion to Chile, I would like to ask you if you can to talk more about people who came to Chile to study this neighborhood justice, alternative justice system, who were, and what drove their attention to Chile back then, and your own attention, like to Kenya, and what drove you guys to take this decision, this research decisions.
Let me talk about, I supervised Helene Itzvart's dissertation, but I'd rather talk about myself because
Well, I have to step out for a minute. I'll be right back. I thought this was going to be over by now.
So let me put you back into a moment in American history in the early 1960s, early to mid 1960s. The United States thought of itself as not tainted by the experience of colonialism. Of course, that's false, we know, but it was not a colonial empire in the same way that England and France were, and Spain. And so it saw itself as a force for liberation, actually. That's the first part of it. The second part is that Africa, as seen from the perspective of the United States in 1960, was a site of great hopefulness. It looked as though independence was going to be won mostly peacefully. Obviously, there was fighting in Kenya, Mau Mau. There was fighting in South Africa and in other countries, but it was mostly peaceful. And it was going to be a period of rapid development and social change. And the United States thought it could play a useful role. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of that. And I would say not really so much by way of self-exculpation. I was not actually involved in that. I went to Kenya purely as a researcher, but others went to help in legal education, in improving the courts, access to legal services, etc. So it was a time when people in the United States thought they could be helpful and valuable to the rest of the world. After Vietnam, after Afghanistan, after Iraq, and I could name plenty of other venues, it's obviously impossible to think that. But that was what drew many young idealistic Americans to the third world, what we call the third world at the time. Just looking around the room at the first meeting of critical legal studies in Wisconsin in 1977, a majority of the 20 or so, 24 people there had had experience abroad and came to CLS partly as a result of that.
On the subject of critical legal studies, Professor Trubeck, could you also just give a couple of words how was to like drive these two horses, as you mentioned? It was in São Paulo. You said you were feeling yourself in the the people in like the circle when you have this act where the guy put one foot and two horses, and the horses start to drift apart. And how was it to manage this fighting between critical legal studies and law and society scholars? And what was the outcome of your thought, your reflection on this subject?
How much time do you have?
Huh?
How much time do you have is the question.
Well,
15 minutes.
No. The answer to that is, of course, as you mentioned, I have written about this, and I refer you and the students to the 3 articles that I just sent you. But did we ever get everybody together? Absolutely not. Was I caught in the middle between two things that I not only believed in, but had been, a major figure in creating, and then all of a sudden, one became the strong critic of the other? Did we ever resolve that? Absolutely not. After a while, I think the CLS people have other things to do than worry about law and society, but there was tension, significant tension in various
CLS was explicitly anti-empirical. They viewed empiricism as the enemy, as a distraction from the real issues, and they were just contemptuous of people who did empirical research. I'll give you an anecdote. Maybe this should wind it up. Duncan Kennedy, who was Dave's student and my acquaintance, and obviously the leading figure in CLS, Duncan Kennedy wrote a draft of a critique of legal education. He wrote it when he was a law student, how the law school fails, and then he made it into what he called the Little Red Book, and it did, like Mao's Little Red Book, have a red cover, and it was widely publicized. And Duncan is very smart and very articulate, and he had many interesting insights. And so I wrote to him, and he was a friend. I said, Duncan, I thought you had such interesting ideas in the book. You know, there's a lot of empirical research on what you're writing, but what you've written about, I think it would strengthen your argument if you incorporated it. I never got an answer. And of course, he never incorporated it. That was the attitude of CLS towards.
It was impossible to ride this horse.
It was impossible to ride the horse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So now I think we could, following our schedule, have the question for students.
Okay, so Rick, I'm going to leave you with that. This is Rick's project, and I had planned to leave by now. So I just wanted to thank you for asking us to do this, because it's been very helpful to me to go back and learn about things that I didn't really know about, particularly the early period, so I hope we've been helpful. I've sent several articles on the history of law and society. If you want to get into more detail, there are 3 articles that I sent to João Victor. I sent the citations, and if you want to go further, there's quite a literature. But you know, I think we've given you the basics as to how it got started and how it got established in the universities, which at this moment for you is an important part of the story. I hope we've been helpful, and good luck. And I guess I'll see some of you, at least in the Brazil session. As they say in São Paulo, até logo.
Thank you so much, Professor
André,
Trubeck.
muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Muito obrigado.
De nada.
Merci.
Hasta la vista.
Okay, so let me review the theme from Professor Trubeck. Now we can talk to each other, and Rick has some questions for the audience now. So let's move on.
I'm gonna watch this, but I don't want to participate particularly, because it really is a discussion among you, and we've already had some suggestions. So I pose questions at 2 levels. What are the single most pressing questions confronting Chilean society today, and what role does law play in those at the level of the macro? And then at the level of the micro, can you draw on your own experiences to imagine or propose to your students the kinds of research questions that they might be able to pursue themselves?
Right. I don't know if anyone, Professor Agustin, want to start. I have something I prepared, a little idea, but you can step in, Professor Agustin.
Yeah, so I think before actually moving into those pressing questions, which I believe they will come, I think we need to agree in some form of organization that it's very open, as the International Law and Society Association is. in terms of not basically claiming ownership of the movement to exclude people, but rather to open it up for more people to come. We need to gather some momentum. As I told you before, Joao, I sent this paper to the Law and Society Congress, and it was rejected, which was a surprise for me because I thought Law and Society never rejected anything. It never happened to me in the conferences, in the international conference ever. And I always had my table and presented with people that were interested in the things I was talking, in particular with Deborah Hensler group and class actions. And I think we should be really open not to try to basically identify this movement with any university or with any kind of founding professors. We all have been trained in the US or in sociology of the law. And we know that we are not the creators of this. We just want more people to engage. And so I think we should be more open than we have been thus far. And I think we also should basically push for more empiricism. I kind of internally laugh when Professor Abel told about having funding and having this interdisciplinary research and putting all the dirty work of doing number crunching and treating the data to colleagues in other departments. My last 4 papers have been just that. Basically funding to do empirical research with people from other schools which are not law, and basically I coming with some theory of new institutional developments of something and pushing the numbers to other people to treat and then get their conclusions and put them in a good story. And I've reached the Studies in Higher Education journal, which is, I believe, the most prestigious one in higher education now by doing that methods. The sad thing about it is we're 60 years behind the US in that we're just start doing it. Like the Chilean law school ever gave funding for something to found a project that mandatorily involved 1 people from the engineer department and 1 people from the law department. That just happened 2 years ago. Before that, nothing. And I'm researching with a professor from the Catholic University about fundacits, which are, Professor Abel, are kind of typical research grant for university level professors. And we went empirically and researched all the fundacits granted since 2019. And we found out that only 8% of them are somewhat empirical. I wouldn't say just plain empirical, but somewhat empirical. And the rest of them, 92 of them, are still dogmatic, law in the books, black letter law thing. So we are really, really weak right now. And I think that we need to find some way of funding more of this research. Our dean did it once and haven't done it again. And we need to try to engage all the doctorate degrees that are going on in Chile right now, which I believe involve 6 schools. If in those 6 schools there is just 1 student that it's engaging in law and society and research, then I think it would be a huge win. As I remember, you, Joao, just found about it in the class I gave in the doctorate degree here. So it's not very popular, and I haven't been able to teach law and society and back again in the doctorate program here in the university. We're against the odds somewhat.
This is such a good research project, Professor Agustin, because I think it connects a lot with what I was trying to think about last night, preparing my answer. I mean, I'm from Brazil. My first contact with social sciences actually were in the social sciences faculty, where Alvaro and I want to tell you guys that Alvaro is now in Florida, and we were colleagues at our first year of undergraduate studies. So, but I think in Brazil, things are really starting to take off, and there's a lot of things going on right there right now. But here in Chile, actually, there were some people who were trying to start something like a jurisprudence, sociological jurisprudence in the 70s, and this period which Professor Abel called the first generation. So back then, you see what Edmundo Fuenzalida called basic investigation in law and society. And well, we could mention, why not, Novoa Monreal, for example, was trying to study social change and its relationship with law. But, you know, the wave of military dictatorships in Latin America had a kind of devastating effect on the academic world in general, and particularly on Chile. So this sort of social legal tradition was slower to develop here in Chile than it was, for example, in Brazil or South Africa. And I think formalism still maintained a stronghold in legal academy in Chile, like as Professor Barwale was saying. So, I mean, formalism is still quite strong in Brazil too. But the purpose of this program is starting like to disrupt this discourse. So what we need, actually, I think we need diagnostic. We need to diagnose a diagnostic. And what I really want to know, you know, you guys, Alvaro said, we've always been this kind of pendulum swing, and we come here, we create the Chilean Law and Society with just on the eve of its creation of the Chilean Law and Society Association, and then the pendulum's gonna swing back, and then like in the US, you have this problem, and understand that for Bolsonarism, in terms of Bolsonaro followers in Brazil, Kimberly Crenshaw is the American Paulo Freire, and so you guys cut the funding programs in the U.S., and you know, we always will be in this kind of knowledge production dependence scheme, and so we get out of a period, and we have a back of like taking off, and then we have a backlash, and then there is my question here, and actually now in Chile we are in a sort of social movements language hangover, because we've had two very interesting constitution making processes, but the very language of social sciences now is kind of in a moment of disciplinary attack, under a disciplinary attack within law faculties. But what I'm more interested in is that actually in Chile, we lack people, intellectuals at the pinnacle of the disciplinary pyramid, high status intellectuals, as the paper says, who are actually engaged in these initiatives. And I mean, if you, Professor Abel, I think you have no knowledge about that, but Carl Schmitt's very popular in Chile, you know? And by doing so, I think I'm putting my scholar career under a risk. I'm being threatened to say that, but I think, for example, the way people have been thinking about social movements in Chile, I mean, high status intellectual lectures don't want to engage with something new when they already have their like academic capital belly full, while like talking about very doctrinal subjects like constituent power. So in 2019, the uprisings were reduced to a manifestation of constituent power, and then it hasn't worked. So now we are just avoiding any discussion. I think this is the hugest challenge for Chilean academy nowadays. I think this is a very delicate play to be played. It has to be played jointly. We have to come together like Professor Barroalé, Professor Miraleu, who is the coordinator, organizer of this program. So I just want to pull out this question and maybe ask your thoughts on that. What are your thoughts about this, like constituent power relation to social movement? So it's just the reduction of social reality under this like umbrella doctrinal, very broad defined concept.
Okay, let me respond to several of the recent comments. First, some very practical thoughts about ways in which collaboration might occur to overcome some of the obstacles that you're confronting. One, Augustine, this is directed specifically to your question, which is the indifference, perhaps even contempt, among lawyers and maybe students as well for empirical research. In the US, I don't think it's anything like that, but an antidote has been the fact that expert knowledge is vitally important in all kinds of legal practice. It's vitally important in judicial decision-making, how to evaluate expert testimony. It's vitally important in being a legal practitioner, using economic data, using statistical data, being able to read balance sheets, etc. I wasn't directly involved in this, but one of my colleagues initiated a class in sort of basic social science methods for law students. And it was an option, and it was very popular. I don't know whether that would work in Chile, but I think it would be worth trying. And pitching it as not a way of changing society, not as an abstract form of liberal education, but as a practical tool that you will need as a lawyer, either as a legal scholar in interpreting data that is relevant to the topics you're working on, or as a practitioner. So that's one possibility. The second has to do with both funding and social or cultural capital. The comparative research project that Fabio and Dave and I and many others are involved in concerning autocratic legalism in a variety of countries is precisely that. It's a collaborative research project in which the direction does not come from the United States. I think that could be a useful framework for lots of other projects where the initiative comes from the Global South and involves in a variety of countries in the Global South. For instance, in the autocratic legalism project, it includes Brazil, South Africa, and India, and obviously other countries, but those are examples. And then you could perhaps get funding from the US without it being a US-led topic. And you would have as I said, the intellectual capital, and it would be a truly collaborative experience. Augustine, I have no role in Law and Society organization, but I'm disappointed that they turned down your paper. That should not have happened, and I hope it will not happen again in the future. The whole the whole virtue of Law and Society is that it is an open organization. That has been, and it's quite different in that respect from other disciplinary associations, where in fact it's very difficult to get on the conference program. So I think you should model your own organizations on what Law and Society used to be, and let's hope it will become in the future. And then finally, on this larger question of being in a state of siege in a hostile political environment, I fear that's where we are going, where we are, and where we are going to be even more so after next Tuesday. And you know, we are in a better situation in the U.S. because we have very wealthy private institutions that are not beholden to the government. And Trump can make all the threats he wants, but he cannot, in fact, control Harvard University or Yale or any of the other major private institutions. And the same is true for the public institutions that are funded by state governments, not by the federal government. But yes, I think the hostility of an extreme right government, which we're expecting in the United States, to any form of scientific research, including social science, is something we're going to have to reckon with. I'm going to have to go as well, and I think this should be a conversation among the rest of you. But I would just second what Dave said, which is this has been enormously illuminating. I would have loved, as Juan knows, to have gone to Chile. It didn't work this time, but I'm excited to be able to engage in this kind of dialogue virtually, which, as Dave says, is likely to be where we spend most of our time in the future. So thank you all, and I hope to see you again.
Just before closing the section, I'm going to be now a little less humble and say that this was a historical moment for Law and Society in Chile. It's going to be available online. So basically, we managed to bring together here these two trailblazers, all-stars, globetrotters, rock stars of Law and Society world. So I am really very thankful. Many thanks, Professor Abel. And we had here also in the audience Professor Brian Tamanaha, he's going to come to Chile. So our funds are going to be applied to bringing him to Chile instead of you guys. So, and a bunch of other people. So I hope we meet up personally soon. And want to thank very much everybody here in the room for your attention and your patience.
I just wanted to make a quick comment before everyone leaves, Dr. Richard Abel. We don't have Trump in Florida, but we do have Ron DeSantis. So I don't know which one is worse.
I'm all too aware of that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, see you in the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next session on 15 November with Professor Fábio Sai Silva. Bye-bye.